It was early October of 2012 when I found myself driving along a narrow back road outside a small town in northern Pennsylvania. I had taken a week off work, thinking I'd spend it in peace, somewhere quiet, away from the noise of people and traffic. I found a listing online for a small cabin near an old graveyard, just outside a town called Ridgeton. The photos made it look peaceful. Weathered wood, thick trees all around, a small fire pit out front. It was cheap too, which should have been my first warning. But I didn't think much about it. I packed a few clothes, my hunting gear, some food, and my dog, a black Labrador named Duke. The drive took most of the day. The deeper I went, the less the road looked like a road. Cracks, weeds, potholes, the sort of place you knew didn't get many visitors. The woods pressed in on both sides, dark and tight. The sun was low when I saw the cabin through the trees, sitting near a short hill covered in moss and gravestones. The graveyard was small, maybe 30 or 40 stones, most of them leaning, some broken. A few had sunk halfway into the ground. There was a rusted metal gate that barely hung on its hinges, creaking when the wind pushed it. I remember thinking it looked old enough that no one had been buried there in decades. The cabin itself was smaller than it looked in the pictures. The walls were gray and splintered. The porch sagged a little, and one of the window shutters was missing. But it was standing and it was quiet. That's all I cared about. The air smelled like pine and damp soil. Duke ran around sniffing everything while I unloaded my bags. The place had one small room, a wood stove, a table, and a cot in the corner. It wasn't much, but I liked the silence. I could hear nothing but the wind moving through the trees and the distant caw of a crow. That night, I made a small fire outside. The air had a chill to it, and the graveyard was only a few yards away, behind a row of thin birch trees. The gravestones were just shapes in the dark, uneven and scattered, but something about the way they caught the moonlight made them look closer than they really were. I sat by the fire for a long time, listening to the crackle of wood and watching the faint smoke rise toward the treetops. Duke stayed close, lying near my chair, his ears twitching every now and then. Around midnight, I heard a sound. It was faint at first, like something scraping or dragging through dry leaves. Duke lifted his head and gave a low growl. I turned off my lantern and listened. The sound came again, closer, slow and steady, from somewhere near the graveyard. I stood up and looked toward the trees. My eyes took a while to adjust, but I could just make out movement near the old fence, a shape that shifted and stopped. My heart started to pound. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon. The woods were full of things like that, but the way the sound paused and started again, it felt deliberate. I picked up my flashlight and aimed it toward the fence. For a second, I thought I saw a person crouched near the gravestones, but when I blinked, there was nothing. The light hit only trees and crooked stones. Duke kept staring, his body stiff. I called him softly, but he wouldn't move. I waited for another sound, but everything had gone still again. After a while, I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just the wind shifting through the leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and sat on the cot, listening. That night, I barely slept. Every creak from the old walls sounded like footsteps outside. The air inside the cabin felt heavy, damp. The smell of the wood stove mixed with something else, earthy, like wet soil. I kept my flashlight by my side the whole time. In the morning, I walked out to the graveyard. The air was cold and foggy. Dew covered the grass, and my boots sank slightly in the soft ground. I noticed tracks, fresh ones. They were human footprints, half smudged in the dirt, leading between the gravestones and stopping behind one of the larger ones. I walked over to it and saw where the soil looked disturbed, like it had been dug up and pressed down again. I felt my stomach tighten. I stood there for a while, looking around. The woods were silent. Duke sniffed around, whining softly, tail tucked. I thought about leaving that day, but I had already paid for the cabin, and part of me didn't want to admit I was spooked. I told myself maybe someone had been there before me, maybe kids messing around. Still, I kept my rifle near me after that. That night, I couldn't sit by the fire. The air had turned colder, and the sky was thick with clouds. I stayed inside with the lantern dimmed low. Duke wouldn't lie down. He kept pacing, sniffing near the door, ears raised. Around midnight, the scraping sound came again. Slow, steady, dragging. This time it was clearer, closer. It sounded like something moving just outside the cabin walls. My skin prickled. The dog growled deep in his chest, and then, without warning, he lunged at the door, barking hard. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, opened the door a crack, and shone the beam outside. The light hit the trees, the clearing, the old fence, but nothing moved. The sound had stopped. I stepped outside, the cold biting into my skin. Duke stayed beside me, teeth showing, his growl low. The air was dead still. No wind, no rustling leaves, nothing. Then I caught it, the faintest smell, like rotting earth mixed with old water. It came from the direction of the graveyard. I took a few steps toward it, but something about the air made me stop. It wasn't just fear, it was instinct. The kind of deep, gut feeling that tells you something is wrong even if you can't see it. I turned back toward the cabin, locking the door behind me. The rest of the night passed slow. I stayed awake until the first light of dawn came through the cracks in the walls. When I stepped outside again, I saw new footprints in the dirt, fresh, clear, and leading straight up to the cabin door. Whoever it was had come right up to where I had stood. I didn't wait any longer. I packed my things fast, loaded the truck, and called Duke inside. As I was closing the back, I looked once more at the graveyard. There was a patch of soil near the back that looked newly turned, darker than the rest. A small piece of wood stuck out of it, like an old coffin board half buried. My chest tightened. I didn't want to go closer. The drive back felt longer than the drive there. The road looked different in daylight, emptier, like even the trees leaned away from it. I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me, but there was nothing. When I reached town, I stopped for gas. The old man at the counter saw the mud on my boots and asked where I'd been. I told him, near the old Ridgefield graveyard. He just stared at me for a second before saying that no one had lived out there for years, not since the caretaker disappeared back in the late 90s. Said they found his truck near the woods but never found him. I didn't reply. I filled up the tank, got back in my truck, and drove until the town disappeared in the mirror. That night, when I finally got home, I couldn't shake the image of those footprints in the dirt, leading right up to the cabin door. I kept thinking about the sound, how slow and steady it was, how deliberate it had felt. Whoever had been out there wasn't lost or passing through. They had been watching, waiting. It's been years now, but sometimes, late at night, when the house is quiet and the wind brushes against the windows, I swear I can still hear that same slow, dragging sound. It's faint, but it's there, like someone moving through wet leaves, just outside the edge of the light. And every time I hear it, I remember that cabin beside the graveyard, the one that looked peaceful in pictures but never really was. It was late October of 1998 when I decided to spend a few days alone at my uncle's old farm cabin in northern Arkansas. The place had been empty for years, ever since he passed away, and no one bothered to take care of the land anymore. I was 29 then, working a warehouse job in Little Rock, and I'd been feeling burned out. I thought a few quiet days away from people, noise, and traffic might clear my head. I didn't know it at the time, but that trip would be the last time I ever stepped foot in that valley. The drive took almost 6 hours. Once I got off the main highway, the roads turned narrow and cracked, winding through stretches of empty fields and pine woods. The cabin sat about 2 miles off a dirt road that led nowhere. The last stretch was rough. The weeds brushed against the sides of my old Ford, and every bump rattled my bones. When I finally reached the gate, I noticed the padlock was missing. I told myself it probably rusted off or someone had borrowed it. The old wire gate was half open, leaning against a fence that was falling apart in places. The cabin itself stood about 100 yards from a dried-up pond, with a few old sheds behind it. The paint had long peeled away, leaving gray wood exposed to weather and time. The windows were dirty but unbroken. The porch sagged on one side, and a metal chair sat there, rusted and missing one leg. I parked next to a pile of broken farm tools, grabbed my bag, and stepped inside. The air smelled stale, like old dust and hay. Mice had chewed through some of the kitchen drawers, and cobwebs hung heavy in every corner. I spent the first few hours cleaning, airing the place out, and making sure the small generator out back still worked. It coughed and spat, but it came alive after a few pulls. I remember that faint smell of gasoline mixing with the earthy scent of the fields. It felt peaceful in a quiet, lonely kind of way. That first night, I sat out on the porch, watching the dark swallow the hills. There were no lights anywhere around, no other houses, no roads visible once the sun went down. I could hear crickets and the occasional far-off bark of a coyote. The air was cool and still, and I remember feeling oddly exposed, like I was being watched, even though there was nothing out there but fields and trees. I tried to shake it off. It's easy for your mind to start playing tricks when you're alone like that. The next morning, I walked around the property. The barn behind the cabin had mostly collapsed, but inside were rusted tools, a few rotted hay bales, and the smell of damp wood. I found an old cattle trough filled with rainwater and dead leaves. The soil was dry, cracked, and scattered with tracks. Deer, raccoons, maybe a stray dog. Near the back fence, I saw a few footprints that looked human, but the edges were old, half faded by wind and time. That night, I started noticing things. Small things at first. I left the broom leaning against the porch, and when I stepped out later, it was gone. I figured it fell or I misplaced it, but the next morning, I found it standing upright by the shed. Another time, I woke up to the sound of gravel crunching near the gate, slow steps, like someone walking. I turned off the small lamp, listened, and heard nothing else. When I checked in the morning, there were fresh boot prints in the dirt. They weren't mine. The tracks led from the gate toward the cabin but stopped near the side of the porch, like whoever it was had stood there for a while, watching. I couldn't tell how old they were. Maybe from the night before, maybe older, but they were deep, pressed like the person had stood still for a bit. I told myself it could have been a hunter passing through. People trespassed sometimes in those parts. Still, I felt uneasy. The third night was when things started feeling wrong. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something tapping against the back door. Not knocking, more like a slow, deliberate scrape. I stayed still, listening. The noise stopped, then came again, this time closer to the window beside the bed. My heart was pounding. I didn't have a gun, only a small pocket knife. I lay there for what felt like an hour until the sound stopped completely. When I finally got the nerve to look outside, the yard was empty, silent. The next morning, I found the back door latch bent, like someone had tried to pry it open. The metal was slightly twisted, not enough to break, but enough to notice. I packed my things that morning, ready to leave, but the truck wouldn't start. The battery was fine, but the starter only clicked. I popped the hood and found that 2 of the cables were missing. The clamps were there, but the wires were clean cut. Someone had done it. I spent the rest of that day on edge. Every sound outside made my stomach tighten. The generator sputtered a few times but kept running. I checked the windows, locked every door, and stayed inside until sunset. The quiet around that farm was heavy, the kind of silence that presses on your ears. I kept thinking about those footprints by the porch and how they'd stopped right under the window. When it got dark, I turned off the light and sat by the front window, watching the yard. The moon was bright enough to see the edge of the fields. Around midnight, I saw movement near the fence line. Something tall, human-shaped, walking slow along the posts. I couldn't see details, just the outline. Stopped now and then, crouched, then stood again. It was watching the cabin. I stayed frozen, breathing shallow, my heart hammering in my throat. I don't know how long I sat there, maybe an hour. The figure moved closer, step by step, until it disappeared into the dark patch by the shed. I didn't sleep that night. Every few minutes, I'd hear soft shuffling outside, sometimes at the porch steps, sometimes near the back. It was like someone circling the cabin, waiting. When dawn came, I walked outside slowly. The ground near the shed was covered in prints, boot marks, some fresh, some overlapping. The broom was lying in the dirt again, broken this time. I checked the fence line, but whoever it was gone. By then, I was terrified. I gathered what I could carry, my bag, flashlight, a wrench from the toolbox, and started walking toward the dirt road. It was about 2 miles, but it felt much longer. The whole time I walked, I kept glancing behind me, half expecting to see someone following. When I reached the main road, I flagged down an old pickup heading toward town. The driver was a farmer from a few miles over. He said the area had been used lately by poachers and people stealing scrap metal. I didn't tell him everything. I just said someone had been trespassing around the property. He dropped me off in town and I didn't look back. A week later, I went back with a mechanic to tow the truck. When we got there, the cabin door was wide open. Inside, everything was the same except for one thing. The bed had been dragged a few feet from where I left it, and there were boot prints all over the floor, newer ones, pressed deep into the dust. The mechanic noticed it too. He asked if I'd come there earlier, and I just shook my head. I didn't stay to look around. We hooked up the truck, and I left that valley behind for good. Sometimes late at night, I still think about that place. The silence, the smell of dry earth, and that feeling of being watched from the fields. Whoever was out there that week, they weren't lost, and they weren't just passing through. They knew I was there. They'd been waiting long before I arrived. I never told anyone the full story. The cabin was torn down a few years later, the land sold off to some company. But in my mind, I still see those tracks circling the porch, the cut wires, and the bent door latch. It's been almost 3 decades now, and even though I've lived in cities since then, every time I hear gravel crunch under slow, steady footsteps, my stomach knots up. Because sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's hiding in the dark. It's the sound of someone real, someone human, waiting just outside the door. It was late autumn of 2018 when I decided to take a short break from everything and spend a few days alone in a small cabin I had rented in the countryside of Northumberland, in the northern part of England. I had been working nonstop for months, and my head felt heavy all the time, like it was filled with static. I wanted silence, space, and cold air, the kind that felt clean when it hit your face. The cabin was an old wooden place, built decades ago, sitting alone on a patch of land surrounded by dense trees that looked almost black in the evening light. The nearest village was about 6 miles away, and the narrow country road that led there twisted through fields and forest patches where the fog often settled low in the mornings. The first day was quiet. I arrived in the late afternoon, just before the sky went dim. The cabin smelled faintly of old wood and damp earth. There was a small fireplace, a table, a single bed, and a few shelves lined with mismatched mugs and plates. I unpacked a few things, set up my food supplies, and lit the fire. The wood popped and cracked sharply, and I remember sitting there that night feeling like the silence was a living thing, thick, pressing, with only the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustling of wind against the window. The next morning, I went for a walk around the area. The ground was wet from light rain during the night, and the trees dripped slowly. The air smelled of pine and cold soil. I followed a narrow path behind the cabin that led through a patch of birch trees. After a while, I came to a small clearing with what looked like an old stone wall, half buried under moss and roots. I stayed there for a while, taking pictures with my phone, then headed back when I felt the chill creeping through my jacket. That evening, it started to rain again. It wasn't heavy rain, just a steady, fine drizzle that made everything outside look blurred and gray. I made some tea, sat near the window, and watched the raindrops sliding down the glass. There was something calming about it. I stayed there until the daylight completely disappeared, then went to bed with the fire still faintly glowing. I remember falling asleep to the sound of rain tapping the roof. Sometime in the night, I woke up suddenly. I wasn't sure why at first. The room was dark, and for a few seconds, I just lay still, listening. Then I noticed a sound, faint, but definitely there. It wasn't rain anymore. It was a soft, dragging noise coming from outside, near the window. It wasn't rhythmic like footsteps. It sounded more like someone brushing or scraping slowly against the wall. I sat up quietly, my heart starting to thump faster. I looked toward the window, but it was completely black outside. The fire had burned out, and the room was cold and dim. I told myself it was probably an animal, a fox maybe, or a badger. I lay back down, pulling the blanket tighter, but I couldn't fall asleep again. The sound continued for a while, slow, uneven movements, and then stopped completely. The silence after it felt even heavier. I kept staring toward the window until my eyes burned, waiting to hear something again, but there was nothing. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground near the cabin was soft and muddy from the rain, and I saw marks near the side wall. Not footprints exactly, but narrow drag lines, as if something or someone had moved slowly there. It could have been a branch or an animal, I told myself, but I couldn't ignore the way they curved, like someone had stood close to the window and shifted slightly. I shook it off, though, and went about my day, chopping some firewood and walking down to the edge of a nearby stream. The air was clearer that day, though cold enough to sting my hands. That evening, I was more alert. I locked the door early, drew the curtains, and kept the fire strong. I sat reading a book, but I wasn't really taking in the words. I kept listening. Every small creak of the cabin made my skin tighten. Around 10 p.m., I decided to step outside for a few minutes, just to calm myself. I took my flashlight and opened the door slowly. The cold hit me immediately. Everything outside was wet and silent. I walked a few feet ahead, shining the light around. The trees glistened, dark and still. The ground squelched beneath my boots. Then I noticed something. Near the edge of the trees, about 30 or 40 feet away, a figure, a woman. She was standing there, completely still, facing toward the cabin. Her clothes looked pale, maybe a long coat or dress, and her hair was messy, hanging down over her face. She didn't move, not even when I stepped closer and the beam of my flashlight caught her clearly. Her skin looked oddly grayish, like she'd been out in the cold too long. For a second, I thought maybe she was lost or hurt, but something about her stillness froze me. She was standing at an angle, not fully facing me, just slightly turned, and I could see her arms hanging stiff at her sides. The weirdest thing was how silent everything was. No wind, no rustling, nothing. I backed up slowly and went inside, locking the door immediately. I felt my hands shaking. I stayed near the window, trying to look out without drawing the curtain too far. I could still see the faint outline of her in the dark, standing in the same spot. After a while, I sat down near the fire again, trying to think rationally. Maybe she was someone from the nearby village, maybe even lost. But why would she just stand there like that? And how long had she been there? I waited for maybe an hour, checking the window every few minutes, and eventually, when I looked again, she was gone. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound made me tense up. When daylight came, I went outside to check again. There were footprints this time, not deep ones, but definitely human. They led from the treeline to about 10 feet from the cabin and then back again. The shape was small, maybe a woman's shoe. I followed them until they disappeared into the softer ground by the trees. I couldn't see where they led after that. The next day, I packed up early. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the whole place. Before leaving, I decided to report it at the small local police post in the nearest town. The officer there looked puzzled when I told him what I'd seen. He said sometimes hikers got lost in the woods, and a few times people with mental illness had wandered from nearby care facilities, but he didn't seem too concerned. He promised they'd send someone to check the area. A week later, back home, I got a call from the same officer. He told me they had found some old belongings near where I described. A torn coat, a pair of muddy shoes, and a handbag that looked like it had been there for years. Inside was an ID belonging to a woman who had gone missing in 2009, not far from that same area. He said her remains had been found a few hundred yards away, in a ditch partly covered by roots and leaves, not far from the cabin. He said it looked like she had died there, alone years ago, likely from exposure after getting lost during a storm. I didn't know what to say. I just remember sitting in silence for a long time after hanging up. I kept thinking about how still she had been, how she hadn't moved at all that night, not even when I shined the light on her. Maybe it wasn't her. Maybe it was someone else entirely, or maybe my eyes played tricks on me in the dark. But the memory is still sharp. The shape of her body against the trees, the way she stood facing the cabin like she'd been watching it for a long time. I haven't been back to that part of Northumberland since. Sometimes, when it rains late at night and I hear the soft sound of water against the window, I think about that cabin. I think about those drag marks in the mud, those footprints leading to the window, and the silent figure in the dark. And even though I know what the police said, I can't help but wonder if she had really been gone all that time, or if, for a brief moment, I had actually seen her standing there again, drawn back to the place where she had died, too lost to leave. It was a cold, rainy night in northern Scotland, sometime in late October of 2016. I remember the kind of rain that didn't just fall. It pressed against you, heavy and constant, soaking through everything no matter how tightly you wrapped yourself. I had driven nearly 6 hours out from Glasgow with the idea of spending the weekend alone, building a small cabin I'd been planning for months on a bit of land I'd bought near the edge of a pine forest. It wasn't meant to be much, just a small one-room cabin, big enough for a bed, a small stove, and a table. I wanted quiet. I wanted to get away from the noise of people and the constant hum of city life. When I arrived, it was already late evening. The sky was a dull gray, and the clouds were swollen, hanging low over the trees. The dirt road that led to the clearing was soft from earlier rain, and my boots sank into the mud as I got out of the truck. The air smelled like wet earth and pine. The clearing wasn't large, maybe 20 or 30 feet across, surrounded by thick woods that looked almost black under the fading light. The rain picked up as I began unloading the wood planks and tools from the back of the truck, and I remember thinking I should have waited for a clearer weekend. But I was stubborn. I'd already delayed the project enough times. By the time I had everything laid out, it was almost dark. I set up a small portable light and started working, marking where I wanted the foundation to go. The rain made everything harder. The tape measure kept slipping, nails wouldn't go in straight, and my hands were cold to the point that I could barely hold the hammer. Still, I kept going. The steady sound of rain on the trees became a background rhythm, almost calming, though every now and then I would stop and listen. It wasn't fear, not really, but a sort of unease that came with being far away from anyone. The nearest village was miles down the road, and my phone signal had dropped completely about an hour before I arrived. As the night deepened, the forest grew darker than I had imagined it could get. My small light barely reached the tree line. The sound of the rain drowned out almost everything, and occasionally I could hear the groan of the wind through the branches. I kept working until around 10 p.m., by which time I had managed to put together part of the frame. My clothes were soaked through. I was exhausted and hungry. I decided to stop for the night and sleep in the truck. I got inside, started the engine just long enough to get the heater going, and sat there staring at the half-built structure in the beam of the headlights. The rain was still falling, and I could see how it ran off the edges of the wood and soaked into the ground around it. Everything glistened. I turned off the lights after a while and lay back, closing my eyes, but sleep didn't come easy. I could hear the rain hitting the roof, the wind pushing against the trees, and now and then, a soft creaking sound that I couldn't place. I told myself it was just the wind. Sometime past midnight, I woke up. I didn't know why at first. The rain had slowed, and the forest had gone strangely quiet. The silence was thick, the kind that makes your ears ring. I sat up, trying to listen. Then I heard something, soft footsteps on wet ground, slow and uneven. They weren't close, maybe 20 feet away, near the edge of the trees. My heart started beating faster. I thought maybe it was a deer or some animal drawn by the smell of food or wood. I stayed still, watching through the windshield, but the darkness outside was complete. The light from the moon barely broke through the clouds. The footsteps came again, a few seconds apart, moving closer this time. I felt a strange pressure in my chest, a sort of tightening. The sound stopped suddenly, and I sat there frozen, holding my breath. A minute passed, maybe two. Then I heard something scrape against the side of the truck. Just a light sound, like someone dragging their fingers along the metal. Every muscle in my body tensed. I didn't move, didn't even breathe. After that, nothing. Just the rain starting up again. I stayed awake until dawn, gripping the handle of a small hammer I'd left beside me. The sky turned gray, and the rain slowed to a drizzle. When I finally got out, the ground was a mess of mud and puddles. I walked around the truck, expecting to see scratch marks or tracks, but there was nothing. The mud was too churned up from the rain to tell anything. I tried to laugh it off, convincing myself it was probably a branch or an animal. But something about it bothered me, the slow, deliberate pace of those steps. I forced myself to get back to work that morning. The cabin frame went up faster in daylight. I managed to get part of the roof laid out before noon, though my focus kept breaking. Every time I heard a branch snap or a rustle in the distance, I'd stop and look. Around midday, I noticed something odd. A few meters into the trees, I saw what looked like a small clearing I hadn't noticed before. There was something in it, some kind of wooden structure half collapsed. Curiosity got the better of me, and I went to look. It turned out to be the remains of an old shed, or maybe a hut. The wood was dark and soft with rot, the roof mostly gone. Inside, there were a few rusted tools, an old metal bucket, and the remains of a fire pit. It looked like it had been there for decades, but there was something else. Near the back wall, almost hidden by debris, was a small pile of clothes. They were old, soaked, and covered in dirt, but they looked like they'd been folded. Men's clothes mostly, an old jacket, a shirt, and a pair of work boots. I stood there staring at them, feeling a sort of discomfort that I couldn't explain. It wasn't fear exactly, just the wrongness of finding something so deliberate in a place like that. I went back to work after that, but the feeling stayed. By late afternoon, I was too uneasy to keep going. The weather had turned again. Heavy clouds rolling in, thunder rumbling in the distance. I decided I'd pack up and come back another time. I loaded most of my tools back into the truck and took one last look at the cabin frame. The rain started again, heavier than before. As I got in the truck and started to back out, I noticed something through the rain. The edge of the trees where I'd gone earlier. There was movement there, faint but clear. Someone was standing just behind the first row of pines, watching. I couldn't see their face, just a dark shape, motionless. My stomach dropped. For a few seconds, I didn't move, just stared through the windshield. Then I threw the truck into gear and drove off, the tires spinning in the mud before they caught. I didn't stop driving until I reached the main road, nearly half an hour away. My hands were shaking the whole way. When I finally looked back in the mirror, the road behind me was empty. A few days later, when the weather cleared, I came back with a friend. I didn't tell him exactly what had happened, just said I wanted to check the land. When we got there, the frame of the cabin was gone. Every single piece of wood had been taken or moved. The ground where I'd worked was bare except for the muddy tracks of my own boots from before. We checked the tree line where I'd seen the old shed, but it was gone too. Nothing there except wet ground and a few broken branches. My friend said maybe the storm knocked it down or that I had built too close to a bog. But I knew what I'd seen. That was the last time I went there. I sold the land a few months later and didn't tell the buyer anything beyond what the papers required. Sometimes when I drive through that part of Scotland and see the woods in the distance, I think about that night. The sound of those steps in the rain, the scrape against the truck, and that dark figure standing still among the trees. I never found out who it was or what they were doing out there, but I've thought about it enough to know this much. Some places, no matter how peaceful they seem, are meant to stay empty. It was October of 2017, and I had driven deep into the woods of northern Maine for a week of deer hunting. I was 34 then, and I'd been hunting since I was a teenager, though mostly with friends. That year, I wanted to go alone. Work had been wearing me down, and I wanted the kind of silence only deep woods could offer. No phone service, no cars, no people. Just the sounds of wind through trees and the occasional rustle of something moving through brush. I'd rented an old hunting cabin from a man named Harris who lived in the nearest town, about 20 miles out. He told me it hadn't been used much lately, but it had a wood stove, running water from a well pump, and an old propane heater that should still work. I packed heavy, canned food, a generator, spare fuel, a sleeping bag, and my rifle, and started my drive up there before sunrise. The cabin sat about half a mile off an old dirt logging road. You had to park near a clearing and walk in through a narrow trail, carrying your gear. The trees were close on both sides, tall pines and birch that creaked when the wind picked up. When I reached the cabin, it looked exactly like what I expected. Small, weathered boards, a sagging porch, windows smudged from years of dirt. A deer skull hung above the door. The place looked abandoned, but not ruined. Inside was dusty but intact. There was one room with a cot, a table, an old oil lantern, and a few rusty tools hung on the wall. The back of the cabin had a small kitchen area with a metal sink and a stove powered by a propane tank out back. The floor was uneven and creaked under every step. I opened the windows to let in some air and started unpacking. The silence was heavy, so quiet that even my own movements sounded loud. That first evening, I didn't hunt. I spent time cleaning the inside, stacking firewood, and checking the heater. When the sun started to go down, the woods got dark fast. I sat outside on the porch for a while, listening. There was no sound of cars, no planes, no distant engines. Just a low, steady hum of wind and insects. I went to bed early, wrapped in my sleeping bag, the wood stove crackling faintly beside me. Sometime after midnight, I woke up to a sound outside. It wasn't loud, but distinct, a steady crunching of leaves. It wasn't an animal scurrying, not fast. It was slower, heavier. Came from behind the cabin, near the trees. I held still, listening. After a few seconds, it stopped. I told myself it was a deer or maybe a raccoon and drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I went out behind the cabin to check. The ground was covered with leaves and damp soil, but I saw clear footprints in the soft mud. They were human, boots. The steps led from the tree line toward the back of the cabin, then turned away again, heading downhill. They weren't mine. My boots were still dry from the night before. It bothered me a little, but I convinced myself it might have been Harris checking up on the place or a hiker who got lost. I didn't have a phone signal to ask, so I let it go. I packed up for the morning hunt and headed deeper into the woods. By mid-afternoon, the temperature dropped. The forest was quiet, too quiet. I didn't see a single deer all day, not even tracks. Around 5, I started heading back before it got dark. When I reached the cabin, I noticed something odd. My gear inside had been moved. Not stolen, just shifted slightly. My backpack, which I'd left against the wall, was now on the table. My sleeping bag was unrolled when I knew I hadn't touched it that morning. I checked the door, it wasn't broken, but the latch didn't feel tight. It was an old metal hook that could have easily been pushed open from outside if someone really wanted to. My rifle was still there, untouched. Nothing was missing. I stood in the doorway for a long moment, feeling that slow creep of unease crawl up my back. I locked the door better this time, pushing a chair under the handle. That night, the wind picked up. The cabin creaked constantly, wood shifting and popping. I couldn't fall asleep for hours. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, that same sound of footsteps outside. This time, it circled around the cabin slowly, leaves crunching one step at a time. I could hear it stop now and then, like whoever it was listening. The fire in the stove had burned low, casting faint light against the walls. I didn't move. I just gripped my rifle and stared at the ceiling, counting each breath. After a long few minutes, the sound faded away into the trees. When morning came, I stepped outside carefully. The footprints were back, and there were more of them. They circled the cabin, close this time, just a few feet from the porch. Whoever it was had been right outside my door. I followed them into the woods for about 20 yards before they disappeared into thicker brush. I didn't go farther. The rest of the day, I stayed close to the cabin. I chopped wood, cleaned my rifle, and tried to shake the feeling that I was being watched. The forest felt different, heavier. Every sound made me look up. I kept catching glimpses of something between the trees, like movement just out of focus. Once I thought I saw a shape near the ridge, a person maybe standing still. But when I blinked, it was gone. I told myself I was just tired. I packed up my things earlier that evening, planning to leave at dawn. But the night didn't make it easy. Around midnight, there was a noise again. Not footsteps this time, but metal scraping. It was at the back of the cabin, near the small window above the sink. I stayed completely still, listening. The scraping went on for a few seconds, then stopped. I heard a faint thud against the side wall, like something being leaned on or pressed against it. I wanted to check, but I couldn't bring myself to move toward the window. Then, out of nowhere, there was a knock. 3 slow knocks on the front door. Not hard, just enough to echo inside that small cabin. I froze where I sat. The air felt thick. My hand was shaking on the rifle, the only sound being the faint hiss from the propane heater. The knocking didn't come again. I sat like that until the first light started to show through the window. As soon as it was bright enough to see outside, I grabbed my gear, threw it in my pack, and got out. The cold air hit me hard, and I could see my breath as I hurried down the trail to my truck. When I reached the clearing, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. Around my truck, in the dirt, were more boot prints. They circled it, same as they had the cabin. Whoever had been out there had followed me down at some point during the night. I didn't look back as I started the engine and drove down that dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached town. I told Harris what happened, about the footprints, the knocking, the noises. He looked uneasy but not surprised. He said the land around that area used to be used by squatters years ago. People living off-grid, hunting illegally, sometimes breaking into cabins during the cold months. He said a few of them had been run off, but some probably still came back now and then. That made sense. It was the most logical answer, and I clung to it. Someone probably thought the cabin was empty and got scared off when they realized I was staying there. But even now, when I think back to that night, what unsettles me most isn't the knocking or the footprints. It's how quiet it was right before it happened. Like the woods themselves had gone still, waiting. I never went back to that cabin again. A few months later, I heard it burn down, no one knew how. Maybe lightning, maybe squatters again. Whatever it was, I didn't ask. I'd had enough of that kind of silence to last me a lifetime. It was late October of 2017 when I decided to spend a week alone at an old cabin that used to belong to a friend's uncle. The place was in northern Montana, far from any town, surrounded by thick pine trees and long dirt roads that never seemed to end. The cabin sat on the edge of a small valley, the kind of spot where you could see your breath all day even before the snow came. I had been wanting a quiet place to disconnect for a while, somewhere with no people, no traffic, and no signal. I told myself it would be peaceful, but I didn't expect how heavy the silence would feel once I got there. The drive up took almost 5 hours from the last gas station. The dirt road was narrow, and there were no signs, just tire marks and the occasional broken fence post. I reached the cabin around sunset. It was smaller than I remembered from the pictures. The wood was dark and cracked. The roof leaned slightly on one side, and the small porch was half rotted. There was a stack of chopped wood by the wall and a rusty old axe leaning against it. Inside, the air smelled like dust and old smoke. The furniture was plain: a wooden table, 2 chairs, a couch covered with an old blanket, and a single bed in the corner. There was a small stove and a lantern hanging on a nail near the door. I unpacked slowly, trying to make the place feel comfortable. I had brought enough food for a week, my dog, a flashlight, a small generator, and some tools just in case. That first night was quiet. Too quiet. The kind of quiet that feels wrong. I could hear every creak from the cabin, every pop from the fire, and every gust of wind brushing against the windows. My dog, Scout, kept shifting around, her ears twitching at the smallest sound. When I stepped outside before bed, the cold air hit me hard. The moon was bright, and the forest looked silver in the pale light. I stood there for a while, breathing slow, just listening. There was nothing but the faint rustle of trees. The next morning, I walked down to the creek that ran a few hundred feet behind the cabin. The water was icy, moving slow over the rocks. I followed it for a bit, just exploring, but after a while, I started to feel uneasy. It wasn't anything specific, just the feeling of being watched. I turned around more than once, expecting to see someone or something, but there was only the forest, still and quiet. That night, Scout started growling. It was around 2 a.m. I woke up to the low rumble of her throat. She was standing near the window, staring into the dark. The generator had gone off hours earlier, so the cabin was completely black except for the dying glow of the fire. I sat up, heart pounding, trying to listen. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint crunching sound outside, like footsteps in the snow, even though there was no snow yet. Slow, steady, circling the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it toward the window, but the glare on the glass made it impossible to see. The sound stopped when the light hit. I waited, holding my breath. Scout was still growling, but softer now, like she wasn't sure anymore. After a while, I told myself it had to be an animal. A deer, maybe, or a coyote. But deep down, I didn't believe it. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the cold night air, and sure enough, there were footprints. Not animal tracks, boots. Human boots. They went around the cabin twice, then disappeared into the trees behind it. I followed them for a few yards, but they faded quickly into the leaves and dirt. All day, I tried to convince myself someone had just passed by. A hunter maybe, or someone lost. But there was no sign of any camp or truck nearby. The nearest town was at least 20 miles away. I kept Scout close and stacked the wood against the door that night just to be sure. That evening, I turned off the lantern early and sat in the dark for a while, listening. The woods had a strange sound at night, a constant low hum, almost like the earth itself breathing. Around midnight, Scout lifted her head again. This time there was no growling, just silence. Then, a slow tapping sound came from the back wall of the cabin. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. I froze. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't an animal either. It sounded too deliberate, like someone using a stick or their knuckles. I didn't move. The tapping stopped after about a minute, and I sat there for another hour before I dared to check outside. I opened the back door and shined my flashlight into the trees. The beam stretched far, catching the fog that had rolled in from the valley. The air was freezing. I didn't see anyone, but there was something strange on the wall. Small marks, like scratches or carved lines. They were fresh. The next 2 days were the worst. I barely slept. During the day, I kept hearing faint noises in the woods. Twigs snapping, something moving but never showing itself. Scout refused to leave the porch. Every time I looked into the trees, I thought I saw movement, but it always disappeared the second I focused on it. I started feeling paranoid, like I was being watched every second. On the 4th night, it rained, hard. I sat near the fire trying to calm myself down. Around 1 a.m., there was a loud thud from outside, like something had fallen against the wall. Scout barked and ran to the door. I grabbed my flashlight and opened it, shining into the dark. There was nothing at first, but then I saw something near the woodpile. A shape, crouched low, barely visible in the rain. I froze, light shaking in my hand. The figure moved suddenly, slipping into the trees faster than I could react. It was definitely human. I didn't sleep at all that night. By morning, I decided I'd had enough. I packed up everything and loaded it into the truck. When I went to tie down my gear, I noticed something that made my stomach twist. The back window of the cabin was cracked open, just slightly. I knew for sure I hadn't left it that way. Inside, a few of my things were moved around. My lantern was on the floor, my jacket was missing, and the axe that had been by the woodpile was gone. Whoever had been outside had come in. I didn't waste another second. I got in the truck and drove down that long dirt road as fast as I could without sliding off. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me, but the road stayed empty the whole way back to the highway. When I finally reached the nearest town, I stopped at a small diner. My hands were shaking as I drank my coffee. There was a layer of mud on my boots and scratches on my arms from running through the woods. I told the man behind the counter that someone had been at the cabin, maybe breaking in, but I didn't give details. I didn't even know what to say. He looked at me for a while and said quietly that it wasn't the first time someone had come down from that area with stories like mine. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I read online that it had burned down. No one knew how. Maybe lightning, maybe something else. I didn't care to find out. Even now, I still think about those footsteps, those marks on the wall, and the window that had been left open. Whoever was out there wasn't lost. They knew exactly where I was and how to stay just far enough away. Sometimes at night, when the house gets quiet, I swear I can still hear that same slow tapping sound. 3 taps, a pause, then 2 more. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to spend a few days alone out in the woods near northern Minnesota. I'd been feeling burnt out from work and wanted some quiet. No phones, no people, no city sounds. My uncle had once owned a small hunting cabin near the edge of a forest, about a mile off a gravel road that no one really used anymore. He'd sold the land years ago, but the cabin still stood. From what I'd heard, no one ever bothered with it after that. It had no running water or power, but I didn't care. I just wanted some space to breathe. I parked my truck at the end of the narrow dirt path that led deeper into the trees. The road was too overgrown for driving all the way in, so I packed up my backpack, a sleeping bag, some cans of food, a flashlight, a small knife, and a portable stove and started walking. The air was cold, crisp enough that I could see my breath. The ground was soft with fallen pine needles, and the forest was dead quiet, just the wind moving through the branches above. It took me about 30 minutes before I saw the outline of the cabin through the trees. It looked exactly how I expected. Small, gray wood, the roof slightly sagging, the porch covered in dead leaves. A single window was cracked open, and I could see old curtains hanging limp inside. The door was still on its hinges, though the paint had almost completely peeled off. The smell around it was strange, a mix of damp earth and something faintly metallic. I figured it was just the smell of rotting wood and rust. I stepped inside and was hit by a heavy, dusty air. Everything was still. There was an old wood stove in the corner, a table with one leg broken, and a few pieces of furniture that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Cobwebs hung in every corner. The floor creaked under my boots as I walked around. A faded coat still hung by the door. There were cans of food on a shelf, the labels half peeled off. The place looked frozen in time, like whoever left had just walked out and never came back. I set up my sleeping bag near the far wall, away from the door. The windows were covered in grime, but I could still see the trees moving outside. I spent most of the afternoon cleaning a bit and setting up a small fire in the stove. The warmth helped push out the smell of rot that clung to everything. By evening, it was already getting dark, and the forest outside turned into a wall of black. That first night, I barely slept. Every sound seemed to echo inside the cabin. The wind rubbing the trees, branches tapping against the roof, the crack of settling wood. Around midnight, I heard something out back. It wasn't close, but it was steady, like slow, deliberate steps crunching over dry leaves. I held my breath and listened. The steps stopped after a minute. I told myself it was probably a deer and forced myself to go back to sleep. The next morning, I went outside to get some air. The ground behind the cabin was disturbed. Patches of dirt turned up and leaves pushed aside. I knelt down and saw shoe prints. Not boots or animal tracks. Regular shoes. Human. The size looked like a man's and they were fresh, the edges still crisp. I tried to brush it off, thinking maybe someone had been here recently. But when I looked around, the forest was empty, silent again. I spent most of that day trying to distract myself. I gathered some firewood, took a walk near the lake about half a mile east, and tried to take in the quiet that I'd come for. But the feeling of being watched never left. Every time I turned around, I expected to see someone between the trees. The light faded fast that day, and by the time I got back to the cabin, it was already getting cold. That night, it got worse. I woke up to the sound of something scraping the outer wall of the cabin. Not an animal. It was too steady. Metal against wood, slow and drawn out. I froze, listening to it move from one side of the cabin to the other. The sound stopped near the window where I was sleeping. I held my flashlight tight but didn't turn it on. I didn't want to give away that I was awake. For almost an hour, I lay still, every muscle in my body tense. Then, just as suddenly as it started, the sound stopped. In the morning, I checked outside again. On the wood near the window, there were deep scratches, long, thin grooves, like someone had dragged a knife or some sharp tool across it. The dirt under the window was disturbed again. More footprints. This time, they circled the cabin. I felt a weight in my stomach that wouldn't go away. My plan had been to stay 3 nights, but I decided I'd leave the next morning. I didn't see any reason to stick around. I packed most of my gear and kept it ready by the door. The day passed slow. I barely ate, just sat there, listening to the forest. Every little noise put me on edge. As night came, I set the fire low, not wanting the light to be too bright from outside. Around midnight again, I heard it. The same sound, footsteps, but this time closer, slower. Then a faint creak on the porch. My pulse started pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I didn't move. The door handle rattled. Once, then again, harder. Whoever it was knew someone was inside. I reached for my knife and crouched near the stove, not breathing. The handle rattled one more time before stopping. Then silence. Total silence. I waited for what felt like hours, staring at the door, half expecting it to burst open. But nothing happened. The first light, I opened the door to check. There was a single boot print on the porch, pressed deep into the damp wood. I followed the prints as far as I could before they disappeared into the trees. I don't know why, but I didn't see them turn or fade. They just stopped like whoever made them vanished right there. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my things, packed up, and started walking back toward my truck. The entire way out, I felt it again, that same feeling of eyes on me. The sound of branches breaking somewhere off the path followed me for a while. When I finally saw the clearing where I'd parked, I almost ran. But when I got there, I stopped cold. My truck door was open. I knew I'd locked it. Inside, the glove box was pulled open, papers scattered everywhere. Nothing was stolen, but the driver's seat had mud on it, the same kind of mud from near the cabin. I didn't even think. I started the engine, slammed the door, and drove until I hit the main road again. I didn't look in the mirrors once. That was the last time I went anywhere near that forest. A week later, out of curiosity, I tried to look up if anyone had lived near that area. Maybe someone using the cabin without permission. What I found made my stomach twist. A man had gone missing out there in 2009, a hunter who was never found. Search teams had given up after a month. The only thing they recovered was his campsite, less than a mile from that same cabin. I still don't know who was out there with me. Maybe it was some drifter, someone who'd been living out in the woods. Maybe it was something worse, not supernatural, just human, which in a way feels more terrifying. Sometimes, when I think about that night, I remember the scratches on the wall and how they stopped right by the window where I was lying. Whoever it was knew exactly where I was. They'd stood there in the dark, listening to me breathe. And if I hadn't left when I did, I'm not sure they would have stayed outside for another night. It was early October 2018 when I decided to spend a week at a small cabin I had bought 2 years earlier, deep in the northern woods of Minnesota. I'd been putting off going there alone, but I needed space, quiet, away from everything, away from people. I took my dog, Riley, a brown mixed breed who'd been with me since he was a pup. He wasn't the bravest dog, but he was loyal and always alert, which made me feel a little safer. The cabin sat about 20 miles from the nearest town, tucked between tall pines and near a small lake that often looked like glass early in the morning. The road leading up to it was gravel and full of potholes. By the time I reached it, the sun was almost down, and the woods had that heavy silence that comes just before night. I parked my old Ford pickup near the porch and stepped out. The air was cold enough to see my breath, and the smell of wet leaves and pine needles filled the air. Inside, the cabin smelled like it always did: old wood, dust, and faint traces of dampness from years of being shut for months at a time. It had one bedroom, a small living space, and a narrow kitchen. The furniture was simple: a few wooden chairs, a worn-out couch, and an old rug that had probably seen better days. I lit the small gas heater near the wall and unpacked my things. Riley paced around, sniffing corners like he was checking to make sure everything was safe. The first night passed quietly. The wind brushed through the trees outside, and I could hear the occasional rustle of branches. Riley slept at the foot of my bed. I woke up a few times during the night, not because of noise, but because of how silent it was. There's something different about silence in the woods. It's too complete, like even the insects know when to stop. The next morning, I took Riley out for a walk along the lake trail. The sun was out but weak, just enough to light the mist hovering over the water. Everything looked calm. I made coffee on the small stove, wrote a few notes in my journal, and thought about how peaceful it all was. Around noon, I heard something in the woods. It sounded like metal, maybe a shovel or a piece of machinery. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I figured maybe it was a hunter or someone cutting wood. By evening, the sound came again, only this time closer. It was dull, steady, like someone hitting something solid every few seconds. Riley stood by the window, his ears up. He didn't bark, just stared. I walked out to the porch, but all I saw were trees and shadows stretching long across the clearing. I stayed there a while, trying to tell myself it was nothing unusual. The woods carry sound weirdly, I told myself. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I left the lantern on and kept the heater low. Riley lay near the door, not sleeping much either. Around midnight, I heard something outside again. Footsteps, slow ones, crunching over leaves. Not animals, heavier. I sat up and listened, my pulse racing. Riley lifted his head, ears twitching. The steps stopped near the porch. I didn't move. A minute later, they started again, this time walking away. In the morning, I checked the porch. There were footprints, deep ones made by boots, leading toward the woods. The soil was damp enough to hold them clearly. I followed them a few yards before they disappeared into the thick brush. It didn't look like a hunter's trail. Whoever it was had come right up to my porch in the middle of the night. The rest of the day, I couldn't relax. I kept glancing out the window, expecting to see someone. Around 3 p.m., I thought I heard the metallic sound again, faint but still there. Riley barked once, low and short, then went quiet. I tried reading, tried not to think about it, but every little sound made me look up. By nightfall, I was tense. I kept a flashlight and a small hatchet beside my bed. I didn't want to leave. I thought about packing up and driving back to town, but the idea of being out on that narrow road in the dark made it worse. The cabin felt safer, or at least that's what I tried to tell myself. Around midnight, I woke up again. This time, I heard something different. Not footsteps, but the faint creak of wood. The sound came from the porch. Riley was already up, standing stiff, staring at the door. I turned off the lantern so I could see outside better. Through the small window, I saw the faint outline of someone standing near the porch railing. I couldn't see a face, just a shape. They were holding something long, like a stick or maybe a crowbar. I didn't move. My heart was pounding so loud I could barely think. After a few seconds, the shape moved, slowly walking toward the front door. I grabbed the hatchet and waited. The door latch rattled, like someone was testing it. Riley growled under his breath. Then silence. A few seconds later, I heard footsteps again, this time moving away, fading into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I sat near the window until dawn, the hatchet in my hand, Riley lying close to me. When the first light came through the trees, I went outside. The footprints were there again, fresh ones, right up to the door. Whoever it was had been there, watching. I followed the tracks as far as I could. They led around the cabin toward the side of the woods where the ground dropped slightly. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. A patch of disturbed earth, like someone had been digging. It was about 20 feet from the cabin, just behind a cluster of bushes. The dirt was loose, uneven, and there was a broken shovel nearby. It looked like someone had been digging there recently, maybe even during the night. I didn't want to know what for. I packed up my things that morning. I didn't care about the rest of the week or the plans I had made. I threw my bags in the truck, called for Riley, and drove off. I didn't stop until I reached the main road. When I got back to town, I called the county sheriff's office and told them someone had been near my property. They said they'd send someone to check. A few days later, I got a call from a deputy. He said they went out to the cabin and found the spot I mentioned, the dug-up area. According to him, it looked like someone had tried to bury or unbury something, but there wasn't anything left when they got there, just the shovel and the loose dirt. He said there were several sets of footprints too, all leading deeper into the woods. He told me it might have been trespassers, maybe someone using the land for something illegal, but nothing more. I never went back after that. I sold the place the next spring. Sometimes I still think about those nights, especially when I wake up in the middle of the night and hear something outside. It wasn't ghosts or anything supernatural. It was just something or someone out there who wasn't supposed to be. What gets me most is the thought that whoever it was probably watched me for a while before ever coming close. Maybe they'd seen me arrive, waited for me to settle in, maybe even watched through the trees at night while I sat inside, thinking I was alone. Every time I replay those nights in my head, I remember the sound of that shovel, the quiet crunch of those footsteps, and the way the woods went completely still right before it happened. I still take Riley on walks near my new place, closer to town. But whenever he stops suddenly and stares off into the trees like he used to that night, I feel that same cold shiver run down my back. Because sometimes it's not what you see in the woods that scares you. It's knowing something was there, watching, and you'll never really know why. It was early November 2014 when I drove up to a small cabin in the northern part of Arizona, a few miles away from Winslow. I had rented the place online for a week, hoping to get away from everything for a while. My job had been wearing me down, and I needed the quiet. The cabin sat alone at the edge of a long stretch of dry land, surrounded by low hills and patches of juniper trees. There was no other house in sight, no sound of traffic, just wind and dry leaves brushing against the sides of the building. The drive there had already felt unsettling. The last 20 minutes were just dirt road, uneven and narrow, with barely any sign of life. My phone lost service halfway up. When I finally pulled into the small clearing where the cabin stood, it was nearly sunset. The place was smaller than I expected. One floor, a porch with a single wooden chair, and windows that looked dark and clouded. The air felt heavier out there, colder, and I remember thinking that the silence was different. It wasn't peaceful, it was almost watchful. I unpacked my things, just a small bag, some food, a flashlight, and my dog, Max. He was a large brown mixed breed, quiet but alert. The first thing I noticed was how stiff he got the moment I opened the door. His tail dropped low, and he didn't want to go inside. I had to coax him in with his leash. Inside, the cabin was simple, a small kitchen, a living area with a fireplace, and one bedroom at the back. The air smelled faintly of dust and old wood, like no one had lived there for a long time. I lit a small fire in the fireplace because the air inside was damp and cold. By the time it got fully dark, the sound of the wind outside had picked up. It made a strange whistling noise through the gaps in the windows. I sat in the chair by the fire for a while, reading, trying to relax. Max stayed near the window, growling softly now and then, staring at nothing I could see. I told myself he was just reacting to the smell of animals outside. Coyotes, maybe deer. But around midnight, I started hearing something else. It wasn't the wind. It was softer, more irregular, like slow footsteps on dry dirt, circling around the cabin. Max stood up, ears stiff, staring toward the door. The sound came and went, then stopped completely. After a while, I convinced myself it was probably just the wind blowing branches or something scraping against the wall. Still, I locked the door before going to bed, something I usually never bothered with when I was out in the woods. The next morning, everything looked normal again. The light through the window made the cabin feel less eerie. I went outside, walked around the property, and noticed faint tracks in the dirt behind the cabin. They weren't boot prints, they were bare footprints, long and uneven, leading toward the trees. The weird part was that there were only one set of them, and they disappeared about 10 feet from the tree line, like whoever it was just vanished. I stood there for a while, feeling the cold morning air on my face. My first thought was that maybe someone was messing around, some local or maybe a drifter passing through. Still, it bothered me. The footprints were too cold looking, like someone had been walking barefoot in the freezing dirt during the night. That evening, I took Max for a short walk down the dirt road before sunset. The wind had picked up again, dry and cutting, and I could hear coyotes calling far off in the distance. When we came back, I made dinner and sat by the fire again. Everything felt fine for a few hours, but once it got fully dark, Max started growling again, low, constant, coming from his chest. He was staring at the front door, ears flat, teeth slightly showing. Then I heard it, the same sound as the night before. Slow steps outside, but this time they were heavier, closer. I turned off the lamp and just listened. The steps circled the cabin once, then stopped right by the front door. I could hear the faintest sound of breathing, slow, uneven, like someone standing just outside the door. I didn't move for a long time. Max stayed frozen, trembling. Then the breathing stopped, and I heard the sound of something moving away into the woods. When I finally opened the door and looked out with my flashlight, there was nothing there, just empty dirt and black trees. But the smell in the air was different. A foul, almost metallic smell, like dried blood or wet fur. I locked the door again and barely slept that night. The next day, I found more footprints, this time behind the cabin and by the window. Same shape, bare, human-like, but longer than normal. The toes looked strange, too far apart. I didn't know what to think anymore. I stayed inside most of the day, keeping the fire going. I didn't have cell service, and I didn't want to leave until morning. That night, the wind died completely. Everything outside was still. Around midnight, I heard it again, but not footsteps this time. It was a low, broken sound, like someone trying to imitate a dog's bark. But it wasn't right. It was too drawn out, uneven, like someone had never heard a real dog before but was trying to copy one. Max didn't bark back. He just backed away from the window and crawled under the table, shaking. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, on the wood outside. It moved along the wall, scraping lightly, then harder. My flashlight beam caught movement near the window, something tall, moving just out of sight. I couldn't see its face, just the outline, thin, hunched, and moving wrong. Not like a person, not like an animal either. It stayed there for maybe 10 minutes, just pacing around the cabin. Then silence. The next morning, I found something by the back wall. A piece of skin or hide, dried and curled at the edges. It looked like animal skin, but with small, fine hairs like human arm hair. That was the moment I knew I needed to leave. I packed my things fast, loaded Max into the car, and drove off the dirt road as soon as the sun came up. As I drove away, I looked back once. For a second, I saw something standing near the tree line. Tall, too thin, arms hanging low. It looked almost human, but not quite. It was facing the road, completely still. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. My hands were shaking the whole time. When I finally got signal again, I checked online about strange sightings in that area. There were mentions of something. People called them skinwalkers. Stories about figures that looked human but weren't, wandering near isolated houses or cabins, mimicking sounds, watching people. I don't believe in stories like that, not really. But what I saw, what I heard those nights, wasn't anything normal. A few days later, I got a message from the cabin owner. He said the cleaner had found deep scratches on the outer walls and a strange smell inside. He asked if I had brought an animal or if someone else had stayed with me. I never replied. I've never gone back to that part of Arizona again. Sometimes, late at night, when the wind hits the windows just right, it sounds like slow footsteps circling the house. Max passed away 2 years later, but every time the wind gets quiet, I still remember that sound. That uneven breathing outside the cabin, and the tall shape by the trees, standing too still, watching. It had been 5 years since I handed in my badge. I was 59 then, tired, half broken, and just worn out from years of dealing with the kind of things that eat away at your mind. After 32 years on the job in Detroit, homicides, suicides, all the messy in-betweens, I thought moving away from everything and settling somewhere quiet would fix the noise in my head. I bought a small cabin deep in northern Montana, about 3 hours from the nearest town. It sat near an old logging road that barely anyone used anymore. I picked it for the silence, for the stillness. It was mid-October of 2013 when everything started. The mornings were cold enough that the lake behind the cabin had a thin layer of ice near the shore. I'd wake up around 6 every day, make a pot of black coffee, and watch the mist lift off the water through the window. I had a dog then, a German Shepherd named Scout, 11 years old, gray in the muzzle but still sharp. He followed me everywhere. I'd take him down the trail that led about half a mile into the forest behind the cabin. I knew every sound in that forest, every rustle, every distant crack of a branch. You spend enough time alone and you start memorizing the natural rhythm of things. That morning, the rhythm was off. Scout caught it first. He stopped in the middle of the trail, ears up, nose twitching. I noticed the way his fur stiffened along his back. I figured maybe it was a deer or a fox, but he wouldn't move, just stood there silent, staring deeper into the trees. The smell hit me a few seconds later, faint, but familiar in a way I didn't like. Sweet and rotten at the same time. I'd smelled it 100 times before. Death. I followed Scout's lead, pushing through some overgrown brush until I found where the smell was coming from. About 20 feet off the trail, near a small slope covered with pine needles, something pale stuck out between 2 fallen logs. I knew instantly what it was. An arm. The body was lying face down, half covered by branches and dirt, like someone tried to hide it but didn't care enough to do it right. The clothes were torn, dark jeans, a flannel jacket, hiking boots. The skin was bloated, pale gray-blue, and the insects had already started their work. Judging by the condition, I guess the person had been dead for maybe a week, give or take. I didn't touch anything. I didn't need to. Years of police work had drilled that into me. But something about the scene bothered me right away. The boots were tied too neatly. Whoever this was hadn't stumbled out here and died by accident. People who collapse in the woods usually lose a shoe, rip something, leave signs of panic. This looked deliberate, staged even. I went back to the cabin, got my old camera, and took a few photos. It felt like muscle memory kicking in. Couldn't help it. Then I radioed the county sheriff's office, which was 2 towns over, and waited. When the deputies finally came out, Hours later, I guided them to the spot. Watching them work brought back memories I'd tried to bury. They taped the area off, took photos, bagged evidence. They asked me to stay nearby, so I sat on a fallen log, arms crossed, listening to the dry wind move through the trees. When they rolled the body over, I saw the face. A man in his 30s, unshaven, hair matted with dirt and blood. There was a hole in the back of his head, clean and round. Gunshot wound, execution style. That night I couldn't sleep. Even Scout was restless, pacing around the cabin, occasionally growling at the dark window. I poured a drink and sat at the table staring at the old revolver I kept for safety. I hadn't fired it in years. I told myself it was just an unfortunate random case, a hiker who crossed paths with the wrong person. But something about it kept gnawing at me. The placement of the body, the distance from the old road, the way the boots were tied. 3 days later, the sheriff stopped by to give me an update. They'd run fingerprints. The dead man's name was Tyler Reeves, 34. He'd been reported missing 2 weeks earlier in Billings. He'd been involved in some shady stuff, gambling debts, small-time drug running. The sheriff said it was probably a deal gone bad, dumped out here to rot. I nodded, pretended to believe him, but I didn't. I spent the next few nights going over the scene in my head. Something about the slope, the position of the branches, the bootlaces, it all felt too familiar. Then it hit me. Years ago, back in Detroit, I'd worked a series of murders that looked exactly like this. Each victim had been executed with a single shot to the back of the head. Each one had been laid out in a similar way, face down, boots tied, arms close to the body. We called him the Cleaner. He killed small-time crooks, people nobody cared much about, and staged them like some kind of ritual. We never caught him. I remember the day I retired. I told myself I'd left all that behind. But now, sitting in my cabin hundreds of miles away, I realized maybe he hadn't stopped. Maybe he'd just moved on. Over the next week, I started noticing things around the property. Subtle at first, footprints near the shed, flattened grass by the tree line, the faint smell of cigarette smoke in the mornings. I didn't smoke, and no one else should have been anywhere near my land. One evening, I found a small piece of paper wedged under the cabin door. No writing, just a blank torn scrap, folded once. That was enough to make my stomach twist. Someone had been close, too close. I began sleeping less, keeping the revolver within reach, Scout curled by the bed. I'd take the flashlight and walk the perimeter of the cabin at night, listening for footsteps or branches breaking. The forest was dead quiet, but silence can feel louder than noise when your nerves are shot. A week later, around midnight, Scout went wild, barking, snarling at the back window. I grabbed the gun, heart hammering, and moved to the door. I didn't see anyone, but I caught the faintest reflection of metal in the tree line, like the glint of a watch or the barrel of a rifle. Then it disappeared. I fired one warning shot into the air. The echo rolled through the valley, but nothing moved after that, not even the wind. By morning, I found footprints in the mud near the lake. Heavy boots, deep tread, leading toward the old logging road. I followed them for about a mile before they vanished in the rocks. Whoever had been there knew what they were doing. I didn't call the sheriff. I didn't see the point. This wasn't their problem anymore. It was mine. Over the next few days, I packed up what little I cared about. Some old case files, a few photos, Scout's leash, and decided to leave. I didn't tell anyone where I was going. Just loaded the truck and drove until the road turned to gravel and then dirt. I stopped at a small motel near the Idaho border. That night, I finally slept. Heavy, dreamless sleep. When I woke up the next morning, I took Scout for a walk behind the building. That's when I saw it. Sitting on the hood of my truck was another piece of paper, folded the same way as the one before. I unfolded it slowly, my hands shaking. This time there were words, just 4 of them, "You found him again." I stood there for a long time, staring at the note, feeling the air tighten around me. Whoever the cleaner was, he'd known where I lived. He'd known when I left, and now he knew where I was. I got back in the truck and drove west until I hit the coast. I bought another cabin, smaller, older, and farther off the grid. I didn't tell anyone my name this time. Sometimes, when I sit outside in the evenings with Scout by my side, I can still feel that old familiar tension crawling up my spine. The same one I used to feel on late-night stakeouts in the city. Every snapping branch, every crunch of gravel, it all puts me on edge. I don't think I'll ever really retire. Not from what I've seen. Not from what's still out there. The thing about monsters is they don't disappear when you quit chasing them. Some of them just learn your address. It was late October of 2013 when I decided to spend a few quiet days at a cabin my uncle used to own deep in the woods near North Fork, Idaho. I hadn't been there since I was a kid. The place was old, built in the late 70s, and sat about 30 miles off the nearest paved road. My uncle passed away years ago, and since then, no one in the family really went there. It wasn't exactly an inviting place. No cell service, no internet, no electricity except for a generator that probably hadn't been used in a decade. But that isolation was exactly what I wanted. Life in town had become too noisy. I needed space, somewhere quiet, somewhere I could think. The road up was narrow, rough, and lined with tall fir trees that blocked most of the light. I had my old Chevy truck loaded with just the essentials. Canned food, a few gallons of water, a sleeping bag, my rifle, and my dog, Ranger. He was a 6-year-old German Shepherd, loyal and quiet. The kind of dog that didn't bark unless something was really wrong. The plan was to stay for 3 nights, just me, Ranger, and the sound of the wind through the trees. When I finally reached the cabin, it looked smaller than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly in the middle. The windows were coated in a thick layer of dust, and a stack of split firewood had long since rotted into dark chunks of mulch. The front steps creaked under my boots as I climbed them. The door opened with a stiff push and a low groan that echoed through the still air. The inside smelled like old pine, mold, and cold air that had been trapped for years. There were cobwebs in every corner, and a layer of dust thick enough to write my name in. I set my things down, lit a few candles, and started cleaning. The quiet was heavy. Even outside, the forest seemed dead still. No birds, no insects, just the sound of Ranger's paws padding around the wooden floor. When the generator coughed to life later that evening, the sudden hum of power almost felt unnatural. I turned on one dim bulb over the kitchen sink and heated up a can of soup on the old propane stove. That first night went quietly. The temperature dropped fast, and I could hear the wind pushing through the trees like distant waves. Ranger slept at the foot of my cot, occasionally twitching his ears toward sounds only he could pick up. I remember lying there, staring at the rafters, trying to fall asleep, when I heard something faint outside. It wasn't an animal sound. It was slow, rhythmic, almost like someone walking. I held my breath and listened harder. The steps stopped after a few seconds, replaced by nothing but the whisper of the wind. I told myself it was probably a branch hitting the cabin or maybe snow sliding off the roof, even though it hadn't snowed yet. I forced myself to sleep after that, though I didn't rest much. The next morning, the woods looked normal again, peaceful still. I took Ranger out for a walk behind the cabin. The forest floor was covered in a mix of dead pine needles and wet leaves. The air smelled of dirt and decay, that early winter scent that clings to everything. About 50 yards from the cabin, I found something odd. A small, circular patch of bare soil, like someone had cleared it intentionally. No plants, no leaves, just damp earth. I crouched down and touched it, The dirt was loose and freshly turned, not natural at all. Ranger sniffed around it, growled low in his throat, and backed away. It bothered me the rest of the day. I tried to focus on fixing small things inside the cabin. The leaky faucet, the broken chair, the window latch that didn't close right. But that spot in the woods kept coming back into my head. I didn't mention it out loud, but Ranger seemed uneasy too. He stayed closer to me than usual, always looking toward the treeline. That night, the wind picked up harder. The cabin moaned with every gust. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something banging softly against the side of the cabin. It wasn't random, it was spaced apart, like deliberate knocks. I reached for my flashlight and rifle, sat up, and listened. The knocking stopped, replaced by a faint dragging sound, like something being pulled through the dirt. I moved quietly to the window and shined the flashlight out, but the beam caught nothing except trees swaying in the dark. I turned the light off, heart pounding, and waited. Ranger stood by the door, his fur raised, staring toward the front of the cabin. I didn't sleep again that night. When daylight came, I went outside and checked around the cabin. The ground near the porch had disturbed soil, scuffed patches, like someone had dragged a heavy bag or something similar. About 20 feet away, near the treeline, I saw a shallow depression in the dirt. When I got closer, I realized it was another one of those cleared spots like the one I'd seen before, only deeper. The dirt here was darker, wetter. Something about it didn't feel right. I spent most of that day inside, keeping the rifle near me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. The air felt wrong. The silence was thicker than usual, as if the whole forest was holding its breath. I noticed small details that hadn't stood out before, like the faint smell of rot that seemed to drift in through the cracks around the windows, or how the ground near the porch looked uneven, as if something had been buried there years ago and was now settling again. By the second night, I was running mostly on nerves. Ranger barely left my side. The generator sputtered out around 9, and I didn't bother restarting it. The candlelight threw long, shaky shadows across the walls. At some point past midnight, I heard it again, the footsteps. This time, they were closer. Slow, steady, moving right past the window. I held the rifle tight, every muscle locked. The steps stopped, then came a soft scrape, like someone dragging their hand across the wooden siding. Ranger growled deep and low. Then came a sound that froze me. A dull thud, followed by something that almost sounded like digging. I stayed there for maybe an hour, not daring to move until the sounds faded away. When morning came, I went straight out back. The ground near the treeline was torn up. The fresh patch of dirt from the day before had been dug deeper during the night. At first, I thought maybe an animal had done it, but the shape was too clean, too precise. It was rectangular, about 6 feet long, 3 feet wide. My stomach turned. I stared at it for a long time, my breath fogging in the cold air. I wanted to tell myself it was an old animal grave or some leftover project from when my uncle was alive. But the dirt was freshly dug, just hours old. I walked back inside, packed my things in silence, and tried to keep my breathing steady. Ranger followed every move I made, tail low, uneasy. I loaded everything into the truck and took one last look at the cabin. Something about that place felt heavier now, as if the woods themselves were watching me leave. About 2 miles down the dirt road, I stopped and got out, just to look back. Through the trees, I could barely see the top of the cabin's roof. That's when I noticed something. There was smoke rising from the chimney, a thin, steady line of it, drifting straight up into the cold morning air. I hadn't lit a fire since the night before. I didn't go back. I kept driving until the dirt turned to asphalt and the trees gave way to open fields. 2 weeks later, I called the county sheriff's office and told them about the cabin, about the digging and the smoke. They sent someone out there. When they got back to me, they said the place was empty. No signs of anyone, no generator, no personal belongings, not even my footprints near the back. Just a freshly filled patch of dirt about 6 feet long behind the cabin. They asked me if I'd been mistaken about the exact location. I told them no. I knew that cabin as well as I knew my own house. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about that smoke, that dark soil, that quiet piece of forest where nothing ever made a sound. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still hear the slow, steady sound of someone digging, somewhere deep beneath the ground. It had been almost 3 years since my ex-husband, Mark, passed away. We had been divorced long before that, but his death still felt strange, like something unfinished had been sealed shut too soon. I hadn't thought much about him until a few weeks ago, when his sister reached out and told me that Mark had left behind an old cabin up north, one he'd bought after we separated. Apparently, the property had been sitting untouched since his death, and because of some technical error in the paperwork, my name was still attached to it. She said it would be good for me to go up there, sort through what was left, maybe sell it. I didn't really want to, but curiosity got the better of me. I hadn't seen Mark since the last court meeting we had over the house we used to share, and the idea of seeing a place where he spent his last years, alone, felt unsettling but also necessary. So one Friday morning in late October, I packed my SUV with some food, tools, and a sleeping bag, and drove out of Milwaukee toward northern Wisconsin. The trip took nearly 5 hours. The closer I got to the woods, the narrower the roads became. The highway faded into a cracked 2-lane road, then into gravel, and finally into a rough dirt path. My GPS gave up halfway, and I relied on a printed map his sister had mailed me. By the time I found the turnoff that led to the cabin, the light was dimming and the air had that sharp, dry chill that comes before the first snow of the season. The cabin sat on a small clearing surrounded by tall pine trees. It looked small but sturdy, with dark wood panels and a tin roof rusted at the edges. There was an old shed behind it, half sunk into the ground, and a stack of split firewood leaning against the porch rail. The air smelled like wet bark and cold dirt. The whole place had that heavy silence you only find deep in the woods. No cars, no wind, just the faint creaking of trees and the distant rush of a stream somewhere beyond the hill. I unlocked the door with the key his sister had mailed me. It stuck in the lock for a moment before turning with a gritty sound. Inside, the cabin was darker than I expected. The curtains were still drawn, and a thin layer of dust covered everything. There was a small table, 2 chairs, a worn-out couch, and a wood-burning stove in the corner. The kitchen was barely functional, just a small sink, a propane stove, and a few shelves with cans that had expired years ago. Everything smelled faintly of mold and burnt wood. I opened the curtains, letting the last light of the day in. The view from the window faced the forest, endless rows of trees stretching into the distance. On one of the walls, there were photos pinned up. Most of them were landscapes, trees, rivers, and the cabin itself from different angles. In one photo, I could see Mark standing by the woodpile, looking thinner than I remembered, his face half hidden by a beard. He must have been in his late 40s then, maybe a year before he died. Something about the picture bothered me, but I couldn't figure out what. I left it there and started unpacking my things. I decided to stay the night instead of driving back. It was already dark outside, and I didn't want to risk getting lost on the road. I swept the floor, aired out the rooms, and got the stove going. The fire took a while to catch, but once it did, the cabin started to warm up. I ate a sandwich I brought, sat on the couch, and listened to the sound of crackling wood. The night came fast. Without city lights, the forest outside turned completely black. I turned off my flashlight and stood near the window. The only thing I could see was the faint reflection of my own face in the glass. The forest beyond looked like a wall of darkness. I tried to sleep, but the silence kept me awake. I could hear every small noise, the ticking of the stove, the groan of the wood as it expanded from the heat, the soft rustling outside. Around midnight, I thought I heard something heavy moving near the porch. Not footsteps exactly, but a slow drag, like something brushing against the wooden boards. I stayed still, holding my breath, waiting for it to stop. After a few seconds, it went quiet again. I told myself it was probably a raccoon or a branch sliding off the roof, but I didn't sleep much after that. In the morning, I went outside to check. The ground was damp from the night dew. Near the porch steps, I noticed something strange. Drag marks in the dirt, thin and uneven, leading from the side of the cabin toward the shed. They weren't deep enough for an animal. They looked more like something heavy had been pulled by hand. I followed them to the shed. The door was locked with a rusty latch, but it wasn't fully closed. I pushed it open, and the smell hit me first. A strong mix of metal, oil, and something sour. Inside, there were old tools, a chainsaw, a workbench, and piles of wood. The floor was uneven and damp. In the far corner, under a tarp, I saw a large dark stain on the ground. It looked old, almost black, like oil or dried blood. My stomach tightened as I lifted the edge of the tarp. Beneath it were some empty jugs of bleach, rope, and a pair of muddy work boots. The stain continued underneath them, spreading wider than I expected. I froze for a moment, then backed out slowly. Back inside the cabin, I sat down at the table, trying to make sense of it. Mark had died in his truck, parked along a forest road, according to the report I remembered reading. They had ruled it an accident, carbon monoxide poisoning. But seeing that stain made something in me twist. I hadn't thought much about how lonely his life had become after the divorce, but standing there, surrounded by the silence he'd lived in, I started to wonder if it had really been an accident. The day passed slowly. I packed a few things from the cabin, old papers, his watch, a couple of photographs. By the afternoon, I decided to clean out the shed properly. It felt like something that needed to be done, like closing a door that had been left open for too long. When I went back in, I noticed something else. On the inside wall of the shed, behind a shelf, there were faint scratch marks. They looked like someone had scraped at the wood with something sharp. The lines were uneven, but they formed small clusters, almost like someone had been counting days. I counted about 20 sets of 5 lines before they faded near the floor. I stepped back, staring at them, and the air felt heavier. I remembered how Mark had always struggled with his temper, his isolation. Maybe he'd come here to escape everything, maybe to find peace, but it didn't look like peace. The place felt tense, like it had held too many bad days in silence. That night, I couldn't bring myself to stay inside the cabin. I built a small fire outside, near the porch, and sat beside it until the stars came out. The trees loomed like black shapes against the sky. Every so often, I'd hear something distant. Maybe an animal, maybe wind, but I didn't turn to look. When the fire died down, I packed my bag. I went inside one last time, took the picture of Mark by the woodpile, and folded it into my pocket. Before leaving, I wrote a small note on the table for whoever came next, just that the cabin had been checked, and it should be sold as soon as possible. As I started the car, the headlights lit up the shed one last time. Through the cracked boards, I could see the faint glint of the tools hanging inside, still untouched. I didn't feel scared then, just hollow. On the drive back, I kept thinking about those marks on the wall. I wondered if Mark had made them in his final days, waiting for someone to find him, or if they had been there from before. Maybe it didn't matter. The cabin was a place where everything he couldn't let go of had stayed, even after he was gone. By the time I reached the main road, the morning sun had started to rise behind the trees. The light was cold and pale, cutting through the mist. I didn't look back, not once. I knew I wouldn't return there again. The cabin would probably rot away in those woods, swallowed by the trees, until nothing was left but the foundation. Maybe that was the way it was meant to end. Quiet, unspoken, and forgotten, just like him. It was the fall of 2011 when I decided to take a week off work and drive out to a small cabin in northern Montana. I'd rented it from a man I met through a coworker, a quiet guy who told me it was a perfect spot for solitude. No neighbors, no cell service, no traffic. That was exactly what I wanted. I had been working long hours, barely sleeping, and my head felt heavy all the time. I needed quiet. The kind of quiet you can't get in a city. The drive was long and lonely. Once I left the main highway, the road narrowed into a winding strip of cracked asphalt, then into gravel, then finally dirt. The last 20 miles took over an hour. The trees thickened on both sides, blocking the sunlight, and I started to feel the air turn cooler, sharper. I could hear the stones crack under my tires, and every turn looked the same. Tall pines, fallen branches, and that deep, green silence that fills mountain woods. I finally saw the cabin just before dusk. It stood on a slope near a dry creek bed, small and dark brown, with a sagging porch and a metal chimney that looked rusted through. The roof was covered in pine needles, and one of the shutters hung loose, banging lightly against the siding whenever the wind moved. I parked a few yards away and stepped out. The cold air hit me right away. It smelled of damp soil and would smoke from somewhere far away. There were no other houses, no signs of people, not even power lines. I looked around, only the sound of wind in the trees and the faint chirp of crickets starting up. Inside, the cabin was simple. One main room with a small wood stove, a narrow bed pushed against the wall, a small table, and a counter with a sink that didn't seem to work. The place smelled like old firewood and dust. I unpacked my duffel bag, lit a few candles, and sat down. The silence felt heavy. First, it was comforting. Then it started to press against me, like the air itself was waiting for something. That night, I couldn't sleep much. The wind outside kept changing direction, and the cabin made soft, shifting noises. Wood creaking, nails popping, the faint tapping of a branch against the window. Around midnight, I heard something different. It wasn't the wind. It was a dull thud from outside. Not loud, but heavy, like something solid being dropped on the ground. I waited, listening. A few seconds later, another one. I sat up in bed and stared at the dark window, trying to see anything, but it was just black outside. I told myself it was probably a branch falling or maybe a deer moving around. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was something closer. By morning, I was half awake, feeling tired and uneasy. I walked outside and looked around the cabin. The ground was covered in a thin layer of frost, and my footprints from yesterday were still clear. But near the side of the cabin, I saw something new. A small pile of dirt, like a hole had been started there. It wasn't large, maybe 2 feet wide, but it looked freshly dug. I crouched down, brushed my hand over it, and saw something darker underneath. I didn't dig deeper. I didn't want to. I covered it back and went inside, telling myself it might be an animal. The days passed slowly. I tried reading, cooking, even hiking a bit, but the sense of being watched never left. The woods around the cabin felt too still, too thick. I would catch movement in the corner of my eye, branches swaying when there was no wind, shadows that didn't seem right. Every night, I heard that same dull sound again. Thud, thud. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther away. Came at random hours, and I never saw what caused it. On the 4th day, it started to snow lightly. The flakes drifted down and covered the roof, the porch, the ground. The woods went even quieter. I remember standing by the window, watching the snow build up, when I saw something strange at the tree line. A dark shape, still and upright. It looked like a person. My heart started pounding. I stared for a long time, trying to tell if it was just a tree stump, but it wasn't shaped like one. I blinked, and it was gone. I stepped outside, but there were no footprints except mine. That night, I barely slept. The sound came again, closer this time. It was definitely something hitting the cabin, a solid thud against the back wall. I sat up and gripped the flashlight I kept next to my bed. I didn't go outside. I just waited. The sound came twice more, then stopped. I didn't hear it again until just before dawn, when something scraped slowly along the outside wall. Not scratching, more like dragging. When daylight came, I walked around the cabin. In the snow, I saw tracks, not animal tracks, but boot prints. They went around the back of the cabin, then stopped near the porch. There were 2 sets. I followed them a few feet, but they disappeared into the trees. My stomach tightened. I didn't know if I should pack and leave right then or wait it out. I told myself it could be hunters or hikers passing through, but deep down, I knew it wasn't that. That afternoon, I decided I'd leave the next morning. The snow was thick, and I didn't want to get stuck on the dirt road in the dark. I packed my bag, kept it near the door, and made sure the flashlight had fresh batteries. I stayed awake most of the night, sitting in the chair by the stove, listening. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps, slow, steady, crunching on the snow outside. They circled the cabin. My hands were shaking so bad I could barely hold the flashlight. The footsteps stopped right outside the door. I could hear the faint sound of breathing, not loud but close. I held my breath, waiting for the handle to turn. Didn't. After a long minute, the sound faded away into the woods. When morning came, I opened the door. There were fresh prints in the snow, leading from the porch toward the tree line. The shape of the boots was clear, big, heavy, like work boots. I followed them for a short distance before they disappeared again. The tracks didn't come from the road. They came from the other direction, deeper into the woods. I left that morning without eating breakfast. I threw my bag into the car and drove out fast. The tires spun a few times in the snow before catching the dirt road. My hands were tight on the wheel, and I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone behind me. But there was nothing, just trees and snow and that long, twisting road. It took me most of the day to reach the highway. Once I hit pavement and saw other cars, I felt like I could breathe again. When I stopped at a gas station about 50 miles away, I saw something that made my stomach drop. On the rear bumper of my car, near the taillight, there was a clear handprint. Large, smeared with dirt and something darker that looked like dried mud or maybe old blood. I stared at it for a long time. I never went back to that cabin. A few months later, I tried to find the listing online again, but it was gone. The man who rented it out didn't answer calls anymore, and when I asked my coworker about him, she said she hadn't seen him in years. Sometimes, I still think about those nights. The thuds, the footprints, the breathing outside my door, the way the trees seemed to hide more than they showed. I tell myself it was probably some drifter, maybe someone camping out in the woods, but part of me knows better. Someone was out there the whole time, watching that cabin, waiting for something. And when I think about that handprint on my car, I wonder if he was closer than I thought. It was late October of 2013 when I was transferred to the North Cascades National Park in Washington. I was 33 at the time, used to quiet assignments, but this post was different. The park stretched for miles. Dense forests, narrow trails, and old ranger stations built long before my time. I was stationed at a small cabin near Thunder Creek, about 9 miles from the nearest paved road. It was meant to be temporary housing while a new ranger post was being renovated closer to the main station. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by tall pines, their branches sagging with damp moss. The air there always smelled of wet bark and pine needles, especially after rain. The first day I arrived, the clouds hung low and drizzle never really stopped. The wooden steps leading to the porch were soft under my boots, warped from years of moisture. The place had electricity from a small generator out back, and a wood stove that I quickly realized would become my main source of warmth. Inside, everything looked like it had been left in a hurry. There was a small kitchen with metal cabinets, an old refrigerator that hummed unevenly, a bunk against the far wall, and a radio that I could use to reach the main station. I spent the first evening unpacking my gear, stacking firewood, and setting up my sleeping bag. The generator sputtered now and then, and the forest outside was so quiet that even the smallest creak sounded loud. I remember thinking it would be a calm few weeks. Some solitude, a few patrols, and maybe a chance to catch up on the reports that always piled up. But the quiet didn't last. On the third night, it started raining harder than before. The kind of rain that drowns every other sound, pounding against the tin roof like steady hammering. Around midnight, I woke up to a faint noise. It wasn't the rain or the creaking wood. It was something else. A dull scraping sound from outside, just below the back window, came slowly, paused, then started again. I stayed still for a few seconds, listening. The cabin was pitch black except for the faint orange glow from the wood stove. I got up, pulled on my jacket, and picked up my flashlight. When I stepped toward the window, the scraping stopped. I shined the light outside, but all I could see were sheets of rain. The trees looked blurred, swaying, and the beam caught only water running down the glass. I told myself it was probably a branch or maybe a loose piece of metal being dragged by the wind. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had been moving around back there. The next morning, the rain eased up. I went out to check. Behind the cabin, the ground was soft and muddy. There were marks, boot prints, deep and heavy, leading toward the tree line. They weren't mine. I followed them a few yards, but they vanished into the forest where the mud gave way to needles and moss. I didn't see anyone around. The air was thick, damp, and still. That day, I noted it in my log. Possible visitor overnight. Unknown reason. I tried to brush it off, but something about those footprints bothered me. The nearest trail wasn't close, and there were no scheduled hikers in that area for days. The following nights, I kept hearing things. A knock on the far side of the cabin, faint tapping on the windows, and once, a soft crunch of boots outside. I checked every time but found nothing. My sleep got shorter, my nerves tighter. I started locking everything, even though it was the middle of nowhere. I began leaving the lantern on through the night just to have some light. On the sixth night, it happened again. I was writing my patrol notes when I heard a faint thud near the back wall, followed by dragging sounds. It wasn't an animal. I'd been around wildlife long enough to tell. This was human. I grabbed my flashlight, stepped quietly to the back window, and peered out. The rain had returned, though lighter this time. In the beam of my light, I caught a glimpse of something near the generator. A dark shape, hunched low. I froze. It moved slowly, then stood up. It was a man. He looked thin, almost gaunt, wearing a dark coat that hung loose. His face was hard to see under the rain and the brim of what looked like a hat, but I could tell he was staring right toward the cabin. He didn't move for a long time, just stood there in the rain, looking. My heart was pounding so loud it drowned the patter of the rain. Then he turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing between the pines like he'd always belonged there. I didn't sleep after that. At dawn, I went out again. The area around the generator had muddy footprints, same boots, same depth. The fuel line on the generator had been cut halfway through. Not enough to stop it, but enough to fail soon. I patched it with duct tape and made a note in my log. I tried the radio to contact the main station, but static swallowed my voice. The signal was gone, probably from the storm. That day felt longer than any I'd had in years. Every sound outside made me jump. Even the wind moving through the trees seemed heavier. When night came again, I set my flashlight by the bed, loaded my old Winchester, and kept the lantern burning. The rain started again around 10, harder this time, hammering the roof. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening. Around midnight, I heard the steps again. Slow, deliberate, circling the cabin. The sound of mud sucking at boots, then a dull tap against the window pane. My stomach dropped. I sat up, grabbed the flashlight, and aimed it toward the sound. Nothing, just streaks of rain on the glass. Then came a soft thud near the door, like someone pressing their hand against it. I stayed still, holding my breath. Minutes passed, then silence, only the rain. By dawn, I was exhausted. When I stepped outside, I found something on the porch, a wet, folded map of the park, the kind issued to hikers. But this one had red marks drawn on it, circles around different cabins and posts, including mine. The circles were neat, deliberate. I checked again for footprints, but the rain had washed most away. That was enough for me. I packed up by noon, radio still dead, and started hiking toward the main station 9 miles away. The forest was soaked, the trail muddy, and every sound behind me made me glance back. By the time I reached the station, I was shivering and covered in mud. When I reported everything, the footprints, the man, the cut line, the map, the chief ranger looked uneasy. He told me a few cabins out in the northern stretch had been broken into over the past month. Supplies missing, fuel drained, tools stolen. They'd been trying to catch whoever it was, but no one had seen him. The part that stuck with me most was when the chief mentioned one of the cabins that had been circled on my map, an old maintenance cabin that had burned down 3 years earlier after a squatter accidentally set it on fire. He'd never been found. For a few weeks after, they sent extra patrols into the area. Nothing came up. No more break-ins, no strange footprints, nothing. Eventually, the incidents were written off as vandalism or trespassing. But every time I think back to that rain-soaked cabin in the woods, I still picture that man, thin, silent, standing in the downpour with his face hidden in shadow. The way he seemed to know exactly where I was, how he moved without sound, how he vanished like he'd never been there at all. When they finally reassigned me closer to the main station, I didn't argue. I left the cabin exactly as I found it. Lantern still on the table, generator patched, wood stacked neatly by the stove. I locked the door behind me, but even as I walked down the trail, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was still watching from the tree line. Sometimes, when I pass that area on patrol even now, I see faint prints in the mud near the old clearing. Always the same size, the same distance apart. Always pointing toward where that cabin still stands, half sunk in the weeds. And I never go near it again.